Deep in the Bells with British Museum lies a recording that's different every time it plays. This is that recording. This is PseudoPod, the weekly horror podcast. What follows will contain very dark, very adult situations. Proceed at your own risk and feel free to turn back if it gets too much. After all, next week the recording will be different. PseudoPod, episode 1000, October 31st, 2025. This week's story, The Novel of the White Powder by Arthur Machen, narrated by Kat Day and Alasdair Stuart, hosted by Alasdair Stuart, with audio by Graeme Dunlop. Hello folks, welcome to PseudoPod, the weekly horror podcast, and welcome to our 1000th episode. I am so happy to get to add that magical third zero to the episode count of the best job I have ever had. Straight out of the gate, enormous thanks to all of you for listening, to the entire crew, past, present, and future, and to all our escape artist partners in podcasting crime. You folks are amazing. Happy Halloween. We got you in episode 1000. This is a big episode, in every way. It's not just our 1000th, it's also the last episode for our editor, Shawn Garrett. Shawn has been with the show for almost 800 episodes and is leaving to pursue his love of translated work over at Strange Ports Press. He will be enormously missed, but we are thrilled to see what he gets up to over there. What you're getting today is the story, the usual host spot, and a short interview I recorded with Shawn a little while back. We talk about his influences, his plans, why he's stepping away, the Twilight Zone, quite a lot, that's kind of on me, all sorts of great stuff. Like I say, folks, big episode. Before we get to it, Shawn, from all of us to you, thanks, man. You are an incredible editor, colleague, teammate, and friend. Your boundless kindness and perception are just two of your superpowers, and it's been an honor and a privilege to work with you for so long. Thanks for everything, buddy. You should also know Shawn is not leaving us entirely. Our public domain showcase was always his cursed doll baby, and it will continue to be so. He will work with us as a guest editor during those months of the year when it's time to rummage in old dusty chests for stories that are coming into the public domain within the next 12 months, and will provide his always invaluable advice and guidance on which stories we might run during our public domain showcase in January of each year. Now, on to this week's story, and author, Arthur Machen. This is from arthurmachen.org. Arthur Machen, 1863 to 1947, was a writer of fiction and much more. He is most widely remembered today as the author of the 1914 story, The Bowmen, which gave rise to the legend of the Angels of Mons, supernatural beings who fought alongside British soldiers in their hour of greatest need. His other fiction, novels, and short stories, written between the late 1880s and the 1930s, frequently sound notes of the fantastic and the surreal, playing most often around the edge where the familiar world may suddenly fall into abeyance. Machen's fiction reveals a man who was at war with the stifling scientific materialism, which was the dominant worldview of his time. And this is echoed in his non-fiction works, which include literary criticism, cultural history, and spiritual polemic, all of which justify his memory as the Apostle of Wonder. Novel of the White Powder first appeared in The Three Impostors in 1895. Your main narrator this week is the amazing Kat Day, who will be taking over from Shawn as co-editor of the show, alongside long-standing editor and horror genius Alex Hoffleck. Kat is a PhD chemist who was once a teacher and is now a professional editor and writer. She first entered PseudoPod Towers in 2019 and became deputy editor earlier this year. The best place to find her is on Blue Sky at chronicleflask.catday.com, and you can read her regular flash fiction offerings at thefictionfile.wordpress.com. And also, congratulations, buddy. You always do spectacular work, and I'm really thrilled to see you take that step into the bigger, still, let's face it, pretty terrifying chair. Because all the chairs in PseudoPod Towers are terrifying. Your other narrator is me. Alasdair Stuart is a professional enthusiast, pop culture analyst, writer and voice actor. He is part of the Escape Artists Foundation board and co-hosts both EscapePod and PseudoPod. Alasdair is an Audioverse Award winner, a multiple award finalist including the Hugo, the Ignite and the BFA, and has won the Carl Edward Wagner Award twice. He writes the multiple award-nominated weekly pop culture newsletter The Full Lid, which Marguerite, the love of his life and also part of the EA Foundation board, edits. Now, deep breath, but not through the nose, because the truth is, the time of the white powder is here.
Novel of the White Powder by Arthur Machen. Narrated by Cat Day and Alasdair Stuart. My name is Lester. My father, Major General Wynne Lester, a distinguished officer of the artillery, succumbed 5 years ago to a complicated liver complaint acquired in the deadly climate of India. A year later, my only brother, Francis, came home after an exceptionally brilliant career at the university and settled down with the resolution of a hermit to master what has been well called the great legend of the law. He was a man who seemed to live in utter indifference to everything that is called pleasure, and though he was handsomer than most men and could talk as merrily and wittily as if he were a mere vagabond, he avoided society and shut himself up in a large room at the top of the house to make himself a lawyer. 10 hours a day of hard reading was at first his allotted portion. From the first light in the east to the late afternoon he remained shut up with his books, taking a hasty half-hour's lunch with me as if he grudged the wasting time of the moments, and going out for a short walk when it began to grow dusk. I thought that such relentless application must be injurious, and tried to cajole him from the crabbed textbooks, but his ardour seemed to grow rather than diminish, and his daily tale of hours increased. I spoke to him seriously, suggesting some occasional relaxation, if it were but an idle afternoon with a harmless novel. But he laughed, and said that he read about feudal tenures when he felt in need of amusement, and scoffed at the notions of theatres or a month's fresh air. I confessed that he looked well, and seemed not to suffer from his labours, but I knew that such unnatural toil would take revenge at last, and I was not mistaken. A look of anxiety began to lurk about his eyes, and he seemed languid, and at last he avowed that he was no longer in perfect health. He was troubled, he said, with a sensation of dizziness, and awoke now and then of nights from fearful dreams, terrified and cold with icy sweats. I am taking care of myself, he said, so you must not trouble. I passed the whole of yesterday afternoon in idleness, leaning back in that comfortable chair you gave me, and scribbling nonsense on a sheet of paper. No, I will not overdo my work. I shall be well enough in a week or two. Depend upon it. Yet, in spite of his assurances, I could see that he grew no better, but rather worse. He would enter the drawing-room with a face all miserably wrinkled and despondent, and endeavour to look gaily when my eyes fell on him, and I thought such symptoms of evil omen, and was frightened, sometimes, at the nervous irritation of his movements, and at glances which I could not decipher. Much against his will, I prevailed on him to have medical advice, and with an ill grace he called in our old doctor. Dr. Haberden cheered me after examination of his patient. "There is nothing really much amiss," he said to me. "No doubt he reads too hard and eats hastily and then goes back again to his books in too great a hurry, and the natural sequence is some digestive trouble and a little mischief in the nervous system. But I do indeed, Miss Lester, that we shall be able to set this all right. I have written him a prescription which ought to do great things, so you have no cause for anxiety." My brother insisted on having the prescription made up by a chemist in the neighbourhood. It was an odd, old-fashioned shop, devoid of the studied coquetry and calculated glitter that makes so gay a show on the counters and shelves of the modern apothecary. But Francis liked the old chemist and believed in the scrupulous purity of his drugs. The medicine was sent in due course, and I saw that my brother took it regularly, after lunch and dinner. It was an innocent-looking white powder, of which a little was dissolved in a glass of cold water. I stirred it in, and it seems to disappear, leaving the water clear and colourless. At first, Francis seemed to benefit greatly. The weariness vanished from his face, and he became more cheerful than he had ever been since the time when he left school. He talked gaily of reforming himself and avowed to me that he had wasted his time. "I have given too many hours to law," he said, laughing. "I think you have saved me in the nick of time. Come, I shall be Lord Chancellor yet, but I must not forget life. You and I will holiday together before long. We will go to Paris and enjoy ourselves, and keep away from the Bibliothèque Nationale." I confessed myself delighted with the prospect. "When shall we go?" I asked. "I can start the day after tomorrow if you like." That is perhaps a little too soon, after all. I do not know London yet, and I suppose a man ought to give the pleasures of his own country the first choice. But we will go off together in a week or two, so try to furbish up your French. I only know law French myself, and I'm afraid that wouldn't do." We were just finishing dinner, and he quaffed off his medicine with a parade of carousel as if it had been wine from some choicest bin. "Has it any particular taste?" I asked. "No, I should not know. I was not drinking water." And he got up from his chair and began to pace up and down the room as if he were undecided as to what he should do next. "Shall we have coffee in the drawing-room?" I said, "or would you like to smoke?" "No, I think I will take a turn. It seems a pleasant evening. Look at the afterglow. Why, it is as if a great city were burning in flames, and down there between the dark houses it is raining blood fast. Yes, I will go out. I may be in soon, but I shall take my key. So good night, dear, if I don't see you again." The door slammed behind him, and I saw him walk lightly down the street, swinging his Malacca cane, and I felt grateful to Dr. Aberdeen for such an improvement. I believe my brother came home very late that night, but he was in a merry mood the next morning. "I walked on without thinking where I was going," he said, "enjoying the freshness of the air, and livened by the crowds as I reached more frequented quarters. And then I met an old college friend, Orford, in the press of the pavement, and then, well, we enjoyed ourselves. I have felt what it is to be young and a man. I find I have blood in my veins, as other men have. I made an appointment with Orford for tonight, for there will be a little party of us at the restaurant. Yes, I shall enjoy myself for a week or two, and hear the chimes at midnight, and then we will go on our little trip together." Such was the transmutation of my brother's character that in a few days he became a lover of pleasure, a careless and merry idler of western pavements, a hunter out of snug restaurants, and a fine critique of fantastic dancing. He grew fat before my eyes, and said no more of Paris, for he had clearly found his paradise in London. I rejoiced, and yet wondered a little, for there was, I thought, something in his gaiety that indefinitely displeased me, though I could not have defined my feeling. But by degrees there came a change. He returned still in the cold hours of the morning, but I heard no more about his pleasures, and one morning as we sat at breakfast together, I looked suddenly into his eyes and saw a stranger before me. "Oh, Francis!" I cried. "Oh, Francis, Francis, what have you done?" And rending sobs cut the words short. I went weeping out of the room, for though I knew nothing, yet I knew all, and by some odd play of thought I remembered the evening when he first went abroad, and The picture of the sunset sky glowed before me, the clouds like a city in burning flames and the rain of blood. Yet I did battle with such thoughts, resolving that perhaps, after all, no great harm had been done. And in the evening at dinner I resolved to press him to fix a day for our holiday in Paris. We had talked easily enough, and my brother had just taken his medicine, which he continued all the while. I was about to begin my topic when the words forming in my mind vanished, and I wondered for a second what icy and intolerable weight oppressed my heart and suffocated me, as with the unutterable horror of a coffin lid nailed down on the living. We had dined without candles. The room had slowly grown from twilight to gloom, and the walls and corners were indistinct in the shadow. But from where I sat, I looked out into the street, and as I thought of what I would say to Francis, the sky began to flush and shine, as it had done on a well-remembered evening. And in the gap between two dark masses that were houses, an awful pageantry of flame appeared, lurid whirls of writhed cloud, and utter depths burning grey masses, like the fume blown from a smoking city, and an evil glory blazing far above, shot with tongues of more ardent fire, and below, as if there were a deep pool of blood. I looked down to where my brother sat facing me, and the words were shaped on my lips when I saw his hand resting on the table. Between the thumb and forefinger of the closed hand there was a mark, a small patch, about the size of a sixpence, and somewhat the colour of a bad bruise. Yet by some sense I cannot define, I knew that what I saw was no bruise at all. Oh, if human flesh could burn with flame, and if flame could be black as pitch, such was that before me. Without thought or fashioning of words, grey horror shaped within me at the sight, and in an inner cell it was known to be a brand. For the moment the stained sky became dark as midnight, and when the light returned to me, I was alone in the silent room, and soon after I heard my brother go out. Late as it was, I put on my hat and went to Dr. Haberdin, and in his great consulting room, ill-lighted by a candle which the doctor brought in with him, with stammering lips and a voice that would break in spite of my resolve, I told him all, from the day on which my brother began to take the medicine, down to the dreadful thing I had seen scarcely half an hour before. When I had done, the doctor looked at me for a minute with an expression of great pity on his face. "My dear Miss Lester," he said, "you have evidently been anxious about your brother. You have been worrying over him, I am sure. Come now, is it not so?" "I have certainly been anxious," I said. "For the last week or two I have not felt at ease." "Quite so. You know, of course, what a queer thing the brain is." "I understand what you mean, but I was not deceived. I saw what I have told you with my own eyes." Yes, of course, but your eyes had been staring at that very curious sunset we had tonight. That is the only explanation. You'll see it in the proper light tomorrow, I am sure. But remember, I am always ready to give any help that is in my power. Do not scruple to come to me or to send for me if you are in any distress." I went away, but little comforted, all confusion and terror and sorrow, and not knowing where to turn. When my brother and I met the next day, I looked quickly at him and noticed with a sickening at heart that the right hand, the hand on which I had clearly seen the patch as of a black fire, was wrapped up with a handkerchief. "What is the matter with your hand, Francis?" I said in a steady voice. "Oh, nothing of consequence. I cut a finger last night and it bled rather awkwardly, so I did it up roughly to the best of my ability." "I will do it neatly for you, if you like." No, thank you, dear. This will answer very well. Suppose we have breakfast. I am quite hungry. We sat down and I watched him. He scarcely ate or drank at all, but tossed his meat to the dog when he thought my eyes were turned away. There was a look in his eyes that I had never seen, and the thought flushed across my mind that it was a look that was scarcely human. I was firmly convinced that, awful and incredible as was the thing I had seen the night before, it was no illusion, no glamour of bewildered sense. And in the course of the evening, I went again to the doctor's house. He shook his head with an air puzzled and incredulous, and seemed to reflect for a few minutes. And you say he keeps up the medicine? But why? As I understand, all the symptoms he complained of have disappeared long ago. Why should he go on taking the stuff when he is quite well? And by the by, where did he get it made up? At Sace's? I never send anyone there. The old man is getting careless. Suppose you come with me to the chemist's. I should like to have some talk with him. We walked together to the shop. Old Sace knew Dr. Haberden and was quite ready to give any information. You have been sending that in to Mr. Lester for some weeks, I think, on my prescription, said the doctor, giving the old man a pencilled scrap of paper. The chemist put on his great spectacles with trembling uncertainty and held up the paper with a shaking hand. Oh, yes, he said. I have very little of it left. It is rather an uncommon drug, and I have had it in stock some time. I must get in some more if Mr. Lester goes on with it. Kindly let me have a look at the stuff, said Haberden, and the chemist gave him a glass bottle. He took out the stopper and smelt the contents, and looked strangely at the old man. Where did you get this? He said, and what is it? For one thing, Mr. Sace, it is not what I prescribed. Yes, I see the label is right enough, but I tell you, this is not the drug. I've had it a long time, said the man in feeble terror. I got it from Burbage's in the usual way. It is not prescribed often, and I've had it on the shelf for some years. You see there is very little left. You had better give it to me, said Haberden. I am afraid something wrong has happened. We went out of the shop in silence, the doctor carrying the bottle neatly wrapped in paper under his arm. Dr. Haberden, I said, when we had walked a little way. Dr. Haberden? Yes, he said, looking at me gloomily. I should like you to tell me what my brother has been taking twice a day for the last month or so. Frankly, Miss Lester, I don't know. We will speak of this when we get to my house. We walked on quickly without another word until we reached Dr. Haberden's. He asked me to sit down and began pacing up and down the room, his face clouded over, as I could see, with no common fears. Well, he said at length, this is all very strange. It is only natural that you should feel alarmed, and I must confess that my mind is far from easy. We will put aside, if you please, what you told me last night and this morning, but the fact remains that for the last few weeks Mr. Lester has been impregnating his system with a drug which is completely unknown to me. I tell you, it is not what I ordered, and what the stuff in the bottle really is remains to be seen. He undid the wrapper and cautiously tilted a few grains of the white powder onto a piece of paper and peered curiously at it. Yes, he said, it is like the sulphate of quinine, as you say. It is flaky, but smell it. He held the bottle to me and I bent over it. It was a strange, sickly smell, vaporous and overpowering, like some strong anaesthetic. I shall have it analysed, said Aberdeen. I have a friend who has devoted his whole life to chemistry as a science, and then we shall have something to go on. No, say no more about that other matter. I cannot listen to that. And take my advice and think no more about it yourself. That evening, my brother did not go out as usual after dinner. I have had my fling, he said with a queer laugh, and I must go back to my old ways. A little law will be quite a relaxation after so sharp a dose of pleasure. And he grinned to himself, and soon after went up to his room. His hand was still all bandaged. Dr. Haberdine called a few days later. "I have no special news to give you," he said. "Chambers is out of town, so I know no more about that stuff than you do. But I should like to see Mr. Lester, if he is in." "He is in his room," I said. "I will tell him you are here." No, I will go up to him. We will have a little quiet talk together. I dare say that we have made a good deal of fuss about very little. For after all, whatever the powder may be, it seems to have done him good." The doctor went upstairs, and standing in the hall, I heard his knock, and the opening and shutting of the door, and then I waited in the silent house for an hour, and the stillness grew more and more intense as the hands of the clock crept round. Then there sounded from above the noise of a door shut sharply, and the doctor was coming down the stairs. His footsteps crossed the hall, and there was a pause at the door. I drew a long, sick breath with difficulty, and saw my face white in a little mirror, and he came in and stood at the door. There was an unutterable horror shining in his eyes. He steadied himself by holding the back of a chair with one hand. His lower lip trembled like a horse's, and he gulped and stammered unintelligible sounds before he spoke. I have seen that man," he began in a dry whisper. "I have been sitting in his presence for the last hour, my God, and I am alive and in my senses, I who have dealt with death all my life, and have dabbled with the melting ruins of the earthly tabernacle. But not this, oh, not this." He covered his face with his hands as if to shut out the sight of something before him. "Do not send for me again, Miss Lester," he said with more composure. "I can do nothing in this house. Goodbye." As I watched him totter down the steps and along the pavement towards his house, it seemed to me that he had aged by 10 years since the morning. My brother remained in his room. He called out to me in a voice I hardly recognised that he was very busy and would like his meals brought to his door and left there, and I gave the order to the servants. From that day it seemed as if the arbitrary conception we called time had been annihilated for me. I lived in an ever-present sense of horror, going through the routine of the house mechanically and only speaking a few necessary words to the servants. Now and then I went out and paced the streets for an hour or two and came home again, but whether I were without or within, my spirits delayed before the closed door of the upper room, and shuddering waited for it to open. I have said that I scarcely reckoned time, but I suppose it must have been a fortnight after Dr. Haberdine's visit that I came home from my stroll, a little refreshed and lightened. The air was sweet and pleasant, and the hazy form of green leaves floating cloud-like in the square, and the smell of blossoms had charmed my senses, and I felt happier and walked more briskly. As I delayed a moment at the verge of the pavement, waiting for a van to pass by before crossing over to the house, I happened to look up at the windows, and instantly there was the rush and swirl of deep, cold waters in my ears. My heart leapt up and fell down as into a deep hollow, and I was amazed with a dread and terror without form or shape. I stretched out a hand blindly through the folds of thick darkness from the black and shadowy valley, and held myself from falling, while the stones beneath my feet rocked and swayed and tilted, and the sense of solid things seemed to sink away from under me. I had glanced up at the window of my brother's study, and at that moment the blind was drawn aside, and something that had life stared out into the world. Nay, I cannot say I saw a face or any human likeness. A living thing. 2 eyes of burning flame glared at me, and they were in the midst of something as formless as my fear, the symbol and presence of all evil and all hideous corruption. I stood shuddering and quaking, as with the grip of ague, sick with unspeakable agonies of fear and loathing, and for 5 minutes I could not summon force or motion to my limbs. When I was within the door, I ran up the stairs to my brother's room and knocked. "Francis, Francis!" I cried, "for heaven's sake, answer me. What is this horrible thing in your room? Cast it out, Francis, cast it out from you." I heard a noise as of feet shuffling slowly and awkwardly, and a choking, gurgling sound as if someone was struggling to find utterance. And then the noise of a voice, broken and stifled, and words that I could scarcely understand. "There is nothing here," the voice said. "Pray do not disturb me, for I am not very well today." I turned away, horrified and yet helpless. I could do nothing, and I wondered why Francis had lied to me. For I had seen the appearance beyond the glass too plainly to be deceived, though it was but the sight of a movement. And I sat still, conscious that there had been something else, something I had seen in the first flash of terror before those burning eyes had looked at me. Suddenly I remembered, as I lifted my face, the blind was being drawn back, and I had had an instant's glance of the thing that was moving it, and in my recollection I knew that a hideous image was engraved forever on my brain. It was not a hand. There were no fingers that held the blind, but a black stump pushed it aside, the mouldering outline and the clumsy movement as of a beast's paw had glowed into my senses before the darkling waves of terror had overwhelmed me as I went down quick into the pit. My mind was aghast at the thought of this and of the awful presence that dwelt with my brother in his room. I went to his door and cried to him again, but no answer came. That night, one of the servants came up to me and told me in a whisper that for 3 days food had been regularly placed at the door and left untouched. The maid had knocked, but had received no answer. She had heard the noise of shuffling feet that I had noticed. Day after day went by, and still my brother's meals were brought to his door and left untouched. And though I knocked and called again and again, I could get no answer. The servants began to talk to me. It appeared they were as alarmed as I. The cook said that when my brother first shut himself up in his room, she used to hear him come out at night and go about the house. And once, she said, the hall door had opened and closed again. But for several nights she had heard no sound. The climax came at last. It was in the dusk of the evening, and I was sitting in the darkening, dreary room when a terrible shriek jarred and rang harshly out of the silence, and I heard a frightened scurry of feet dashing down the stairs. I waited, and the servant maid staggered into the room and faced me, white and trembling. "Oh, Miss Helen," she whispered. "Oh, for the Lord's sake, Miss Helen, what has happened? Look at my hand, miss, look at that hand." I drew her to the window and saw there was a black, wet stain upon her hand. "I do not understand you," I said. "Will you explain to me?" "I was doing your room just now," she began. "I was turning down the bedclothes, and all of a sudden there was something fell upon my hand, wet, and I looked up, and the ceiling was black and dripping on me." I looked hard at her and bit my lip. "Come with me," I said. "Bring your candle with you." The room I slept in was beneath my brother's, and as I went in, I felt I was trembling. I looked up at the ceiling and saw a patch, all black and wet, and a dew of black drops upon it, and a pool of horrible liquor soaking into the white bedclothes. I ran upstairs and knocked loudly. "Oh, Francis, Francis, my dear brother," I cried, "what has happened to you?" And I listened. There was a sound of choking, and a noise like water bubbling and regurgitating, but nothing else. And I called louder, and no answer came. In spite of what Dr. Haberden had said, I went to him with tears streaming down my cheeks, and told him all that had happened. And he listened to me with a face set hard and grim. "For your father's sake," he said at last, "I will go with you, though I can do nothing." We went out together. The streets were dark and silent, and heavy with heat and a drought of many weeks. I saw the doctor's face white under the gas lamps, and when we reached the house his hand was shaking. We did not hesitate, but went upstairs directly. I held the lamp, and he called out in a loud, determined voice. "Mr. Lester, do you hear me? I insist on seeing you. Answer me at once." There was no answer, but we both heard that choking noise I have mentioned. "Mr. Lester, I am waiting for you. Open the door this instant, or I shall break it down." And he called a third time in a voice that rang and echoed from the walls. "Mr. Lester, for the last time, I order you to open the door." "Ah," he said, after a pause of heavy silence, "we are wasting our time here. Will you be so kind as to get me a poker or something of the kind?" I ran into a little room at the back where odd articles were kept, and found a heavy adze-like tool that I thought might serve the doctor's purpose. "Very good," he said. "That will do, I dare say. I give you notice, Mr. Lester," he cried loudly at the keyhole, "that I am now about to break into your room." Then we heard the wrench of the adze, and the woodwork split and cracked under it. With a loud crash, the door suddenly burst open, and for a moment we startled back aghast at a fearful screaming cry. No human voice, but as the roar of a monster that burst forth inarticulate and struck at us out of the darkness. "Hold the lamp," said the doctor, and we went in and glanced quickly around the room. "There it is," said Dr. Haberden, drawing a quick breath. "Look, in that corner." I looked, and a pang of horror seized my heart, as with a white-hot iron. There upon the floor was a dark and putrid mass, seething with corruption and hideous rottenness, neither liquid nor solid, but melting and changing before our very eyes, bubbling with unctuous, oily bubbles like boiling pitch, and out of the midst of it shone two burning points like eyes, and I saw a writhing and stirring as of limbs, and something moved and lifted up what might have been an arm. The doctor took a step forward, raised the iron bar, and struck at the burning points. He drove in the weapon and struck again and again in the fury of loathing. A week or two later, when I had recovered to some extent from the terrible shock, Dr. Haberden came to see me. "I have sold my practice," he began, "and tomorrow I am sailing on a long voyage. I do not know whether I shall ever return to England. In all probability I shall buy a little land in California and settle there for the remainder of my life. I have brought you this packet, which you may open and read when you feel able to do so. It contains the report of Dr. Chambers on what I submitted to him. Goodbye, Miss Lester. Goodbye." When he was gone, I opened the envelope. I could not wait, and proceeded to read the papers within. Here is the manuscript, and if you will allow me, I will read you the astounding story it contains. My dear Haberden,
the letter began. I have delayed inexcusably in answering your questions as to the white substance you sent me. To tell you the truth, I have hesitated for some time as to what course I should adopt, for there is a bigotry and orthodox standard in physical science as in theology, and I know that if I told you the truth, I should offend rooted principles, which I once held dear myself. However, I have determined to be plain with you, and first I must enter into a short personal explanation. You have known me, Haberden, for many years as a scientific man. You and I have often talked of our profession together and discussed the hopeless gulf that opens before the feet of those who think to attain the truth by any means whatsoever except the beaten way of experiment and observation in the sphere of material things. I remember the scorn with which you have spoken to me of men of science who have dabbled a little in the unseen and have timidly hinted that perhaps the senses are not, after all, the eternal, impenetrable bounds of all knowledge, the everlasting walls beyond which no human being has ever passed. We have laughed together heartily, and I think justly, at the occult follies of the day, disguised under various names. The mesmerisms, the spiritualisms, the materializations, the theosophies. All the rabble-rout of imposture with their machinery of poor tricks and feeble conjuring, the true back parlour of shabby London streets. Yet, in spite of what I have said, I must confess to you that I am no materialist, taking the word, of course, in its usual signification. It is now many years since I have convinced myself, a skeptic, remember, that the old iron-bound theory is utterly and entirely false. Perhaps this confession will not wound you so sharply as it would have done 20 years ago, for I think you cannot have failed to notice that for some time hypotheses have been advanced by men of pure science which are nothing less than transcendental, and I suspect that most modern chemists and biologists of repute would not hesitate to subscribe the dictum of the old schoolman, omnia exeunt in mysterium, which means, I take it, that every branch of human knowledge, if traced up to its source and final principles, vanishes into mystery. I need not trouble you with a detailed account of the painful steps which led me to my conclusions. A few simple experiments suggested a doubt as to my then standpoint, and a train of thought that rose from circumstances comparatively trifling brought me far. My old conception of the universe has been swept away, and I stand in a world that seems as strange and awful to me as the endless waves of the ocean seen for the first time shining from a peak in Darien. Now, I know that the walls of sense that seemed so impenetrable, that seemed to loom up above the heavens and to be founded below the depths and to shut us in for evermore, are no such everlasting, impassable barriers as we fancied, but thinnest and most airy veils that melt away before the seeker and dissolve as the early mist of the morning about the brooks. I know that you never adopted the extreme materialistic position. You did not go about trying to prove a universal negative, for your logical sense withheld you from that crowning absurdity. But I am sure that you will find all that I am saying strange and repellent to your habits of thought. Yet, Haberden, what I tell you is the truth. Nay, to adopt our common language, the sole and scientific truth, verified by experience. And the universe is verily more splendid and more awful than we used to dream. The whole universe, my friend, is a tremendous sacrament, a mystic, ineffable force and energy, veiled by an outward form of matter, and man, and the sun, and the other stars, and the flower of the grass, and the crystal in the test tube are each and every one as spiritual as material, and subject to an inner working. You will perhaps wonder, Haberden, whence all this tends, but I think a little thought will make it clear. You will understand that from such a standpoint the whole view of things is changed, and what we thought incredible and absurd may be possible enough. In short, we must look at legend and belief with other eyes and be prepared to accept tales that had become mere fables. Indeed, this is no such great demand. After all, modern science will concede as much in a hypocritical manner. You must not, it is true, believe in witchcraft, but you may credit hypnotism. Ghosts are out of date, but there is a good deal to be said for the theory of telepathy. Give superstition a Greek name and believe in it. It should almost be a proverb. So much for my personal explanation. You sent me, Haberden, a phial, stoppered and sealed, containing a small quantity of flaky white powder, obtained from a chemist who has been dispensing it to one of your patients. I am not surprised to hear that this powder refused to yield any results to your analysis. It is a substance which was known to a few many hundred years ago, but which I have never expected to be submitted to me from the shop of a modern apothecary. There seems no reason to doubt the truth of the man's tale. He no doubt got, as he says, the rather uncommon salt you prescribed from the wholesale chemists, and it has probably remained on his shelf for 20 years, perhaps longer. Here, what we call chance and coincidence begin to work. During all these years, the salt in the bottle was exposed to certain recurring variations of temperature, variations probably ranging from 40 degrees to 80 degrees, and as it happens, such changes, recurring year after year at irregular intervals and with varying degrees of intensity and duration, have constituted a process. And a process so complicated and so delicate that I question whether modern scientific apparatus, directed with the utmost precision, could produce the same result. The white powder you sent me is something very different from the drug you prescribed. It is the powder from which the wine of the Sabbath, the vinum sabbati, was prepared. No doubt you have read of the witches' Sabbath and have laughed at the tales which terrified our ancestors, the black cats, the broomsticks, dooms pronounced against some old woman's cow. Since I have known the truth, I have often reflected that it is on the whole a happy thing that such burlesque as this is believed. For it serves to conceal much that is better it should not be known generally. However, if you care to read the appendix to Peyton Knight's monograph, you will find that the true Sabbath was something very different, though the writer has very nicely refrained from printing all he knew. The secrets of the true Sabbath were the secrets of remote times surviving into the Middle Ages, secrets of an evil science which existed long before Aryan man entered Europe. Men and women, seduced from their homes on specious pretenses, were met by beings well qualified to assume, as they did assume, the part of devils, and taken by their guides to some desolate and lonely place, known to the initiate by long tradition and unknown to all else. Perhaps it was a cave in some bare and windswept hill, perhaps some inmost recess of a great forest, and there the Sabbath was held. There, in the blackest hour of night, the vinum sabbati was prepared, and this evil gruel was poured forth and offered to the neophytes, and they partook of an infernal sacrament. Sumentes calicem principis inferorum, as an old author well expresses it. And suddenly, each one that had drunk found himself attended by a companion, a share of glamour and unearthly allurement beckoning him apart to share in joys more exquisite, more piercing than the thrill of any dream, to the consummation of the marriage of the Sabbath. It is hard to write of such things as these, and chiefly because that shape that allured with loveliness was no hallucination, but awful as it is to express the man himself. By the power of that Sabbath wine, a few grains of white powder thrown into a glass of water, the house of life was riven asunder, and the human trinity dissolved. And the worm which never dies, that which lies sleeping within us all, was made tangible and an external thing, and clothed with a garment of flesh. And then in the hour of midnight the primal fall was repeated and represented, and the awful thing veiled in the mythos of the tree in the garden was done anew. Such was the Nuptio Sabati. I prefer to say no more. You, Haberden, know as well as I do that the most trivial laws of life are not to be broken with impunity, and for so terrible an act as this, in which the very inmost place of the temple was broken apart and defiled, a terrible vengeance followed. What began with corruption ended also with corruption.
Underneath is the following in Dr. Haberden's writing. The whole of the above is unfortunately strictly and entirely true. Your brother confessed all to me on the morning when I saw him in his room. My attention was first attracted to the bandaged hand, and I forced him to show it to me. What I saw made me, a medical man of many years' standing, grow sick with loathing, and the story I was forced to listen to was infinitely more frightful than I could have believed possible. It has tempted me to doubt the eternal goodness which can permit nature to offer such hideous possibilities, and if you had not with your own eyes seen the end, I should have said to you, disbelieve it all. I have not, I think, many more weeks to live. You are young, and may forget all this. Joseph Haberden, M.D. In the course of 2 or 3 months, I heard that Dr. Haberden had died at sea shortly after the ship left England.
The Angels of Mons are one of my favourite pieces of Forteana. It's one of those ideas that is maddening, jingoistic, profoundly egalitarian and kind, reassuring, infuriating and terrifying all at once. And the way Machen's story stepped out from fiction into accepted and even assumed fact worried even him. Witness this quote from an anthology collecting The Bowman, the story that inspired the urban myth. It seemed that my light fiction had been accepted by the congregation of this particular church as the solidest of facts. And it was then that it began to dawn on me that if I had failed in the art of letters, I had succeeded, unwittingly, in the art of deceit. I would argue that with this story, Machen willingly succeeds in the art of deceit, and the people he lies to most of all are the characters. There are layers on layers to puncture here, not the least of which is the polite assumption that upper-class British society doesn't do things like addiction and self-destruction. My northern, mildly Celtic soul would argue that that's usually because they're too busy destroying the rest of us, but that's a me thing. Keep calm and carry on, right chaps? Except you can't. And they can't, and as the brothers' behaviour spirals and our heroine does the one thing no one in this country is allowed to do, cause a fuss, we see just how many layers of British recalcitrance this bile-drenched cuckoo is nested inside. The family, the assumption of good behaviour, of polite society, the terror of being a tall poppy, and the suffocating weighted blanket of the respect for authority. I love that one of the main horror turns here is that the medicine isn't working, and the visceral chill that sent through even me. It sat nicely next to the nuclear level eye-rolling about his becoming fat being tied to his physical and moral degradation. Jess Nevins has a good point about that, and some context that does not in any way excuse, but does sharpen the focus somewhat. It's no coincidence that Francis Lester becomes an Epicurean and flaneur as his body devolves. Machen was making a comment not only on the reality beneath what we see, the unseen world as a quickening and adorable secret, but on the theory of evolution and en fin de siècle decadence as a sort of response to Oscar Wilde. While Dorian Gray's Epicurean appetites act as a reminder that what serves the senses may slay the spirit, Leicester's prove that what initially seems to minister to the body may in fact hasten its corruption. The former reads his portrait for external signs of his spiritual malaise, the visible emblem, as he puts it, of conscience, whereas the latter actually becomes the embodiment of physical corruption. As for that quickening and adorable secret, and what a beautiful turn of phrase, there are layers of meaning there too. The unspeakable roiling fountainhead of base needs is tremendously British in its idea of feral repression released, and there is a smart note of gender fluidity to the idea that this was a powder that began with witches. That ending, though, in the pragmatic brutality that closes the main story, speak loudly to Machen's central deceit. This is a story about a ruling class. People who are never afraid, being terrified for their lives. The live fast, die young, coke-fueled excess of the future, here in the past and just as hungry. In that light, the other ending is even more disturbing. This is a contaminant as much as it is a substance. One whose spiritual half-life is longer than anyone can dare hope. Keep calm. Carry on. Because it will. What an extraordinary story. Perfect choice, Shawn. Thank you. And speaking of Shawn, here he is in conversation with me. And before we dive into it, a special shout out to Graeme, returning from an extended absence. And this was one of the first episodes that he had to produce. And it's a biggie. So, up front and in public, thanks so much, buddy. Now, over to Shawn. But let's just jump straight into the questions. Talk to me about Arthur Machen. What was the reason behind bringing him in for episode 1000?
Yeah, it was, at first it was, well, I'll be honest, it was a compromise. My original plan for episode 1000 was that we would run two stories. We'd run the Robert Bloch's Toy for Juliet and Harlan Ellison's Prowler in the City at the Edge of the World, which were both published in the year I was born. And wow. I just thought they would be a nice, two stories, two big names, and they're great stories. Especially the Ellison one is just like killer. It would be a great, like, punchy point to have an episode 1000 on. You know what I mean? But sadly, while Bloch's people didn't, or Bloch's people seemed to be good about it, Ellison's people rejected the offer, so we didn't go with that. And I threw a few other things around, but the truth is that a long history of this getting stories for this show has been finding out how badly publishing doesn't understand the internet, so you can't find anyone, and if you can find someone to answer your questions, they're not interested because they don't understand. Like putting a story on the internet, it's like, so it just becomes frustrating after a while. There were any number of things we would have liked to have run. In the Hills of Cities by Clive Barker, all these kind of, or The Jaunt by Stephen King, if we could somehow have gotten Stephen King's attention. But none of those.
I know for the longest time, Survivor Type was Alex's kind of Stephen King white whale as well. I know he really
that would have been great. And then even older stories like They Bite by I can't think of his damn name, but it's a great little story. And we just couldn't. It's like they hold on to the old model, and the old model is the thing itself is incredibly important because it's their only source of of making money from it. And it's kind of like, I get that, but nowadays it's like, if you were gonna put out a collection of stories, like let's say a Shirley Jackson collection, you wouldn't really lose a whole lot of money by giving one over to a podcast so that you could promo it. It's just like, here is one of the stories. Listen to it here, and but anyway, so I went back and forth, and I was like, after a while, I thought about, we could get female authors. So I was thinking, Joyce Carol Oates, Where Are You Going, Where Have You Been? Where Have You Been? Shirley Jackson, something. But then I was like, this is just going to end up frustrating me, and time was becoming a premium. So I just was like, who of the big names haven't we done yet? And Alex and I have thrown back and forth doing Machen. I'm still unsure about that.
I've always gone with Machen, but I live in a country that straight-facedly will put like 5 letters in the middle of a word and never pronounce them. So my version of English is not to be trusted.
So anyway, I was like, we haven't done him, and we were at one point we were considering doing the white people, but it's a very odd story, I think, to have read, because it's so discursive. It just goes, it's a child's diary, so it just goes all over the place. And then I was like, I went back for another reason and reread the Black Powder novel of Black Powder, and I was like, you know what? This is a better story than I remember. Not that I remembered it being bad, but I remembered it as being kind of the same riff as Cool Air. And what I've discovered as I've gotten older and I've, kind of sharpened my critical abilities is that there's a whole lot of things that in the past I kind of, slid off to the side and went, this is just X. And then I come back to it and I'm like, no, there's more interesting things going on here.
I know exactly what you mean. My birth as a critic happened in 2 spots. I remember watching Deep Star 6 with my dad, and I was not old enough to watch this film, so he'd rented it for me. And of course, he thought the best possible thing he could do was to stay in the room and watch it with me. And it finished, and he went, well, that was awful. And I said, yes, but the monster was quite fun. And abruptly, a movie critic was born. And the other one was, I remember, one of the first books I was ever given, my mum gave me a copy of Winter the Willows for my very early Christmas. And I loved it. And I still do. And then when I was a teenager, I went back and watched the stop motion video version that had been done. And I read the book again. And my brain went, holy shit, where did all the class warfare come from? So that whole thing of, oh, what? This is very different. I know exactly what you mean.
Yeah, so in the novel of the Black Powder, it was like, oh, he's making this really interesting idea about how, like, evil is this strange kind of, it's metaphysical, but it's biological too. Like the chemical actually causes a change in the brain that makes you open to more things, but that makes you open to evil, and it's very, very interesting. It was just, and so I thought, well, hell, let's give him a good writer and go out on a high note. So, so that's the long discursive answer of how we ended up with that, or I ended up with that.
So hypothetically, if you were going, just testing something out, if you were going to be talking to the host of a horror podcast that you might know fairly well, who had somehow never read Machen before in his life, would this be a good place to start, would you think?
Yeah, I think in the sense that it's a solid story that just tells its story. That is to say that Machen has this kind of reputation. He's an odd figure in horror because he always gets thrown in there, but he's more like a horror poetical, metaphysical writer. Yeah. He's got a lot of spiritual stuff in his stories, and it's not all of them, but so you'll get these, even what's the thing he's famous for, the awful evil woman story, or the awful I can't think of it. It'll come to me when I'm not trying to think of it. But anyway, it's all about evil and metaphysical concepts of evil. So it goes off into these, and he has whole novels that are not horror. They're just about metaphysics. And, so this, I think, is a good example of something that's kind of a good intro. And then I'd say The White People is the other good one. Also, but because it's also, not only is it really effective, but it's really weird. Like, you read it and you're like, oh, it's a child's diary. And then I think even with Lovecraft, famously in some letter of his millions of letters, was divvying it over with somebody, and you could tell that they didn't totally not get what the point of the story was, but that you could read the ending of the story in a number of ways, some of which are very horrific, like, so, that's where he's just got that ability, I think, to kind of bring in other stuff that you don't get in a lot of horror writers.
I get that completely. And I also, and this is my own cheerful personal bias speaking, of course, I also can think of very few greater recommendations for anyone that Lovecraft didn't quite get this.
Yeah, I mean, he had obviously, he knew what he liked in the genre, and and considered that really effective. But I mean, he also kind of doesn't, at some point, doesn't he kind of run down M.R. James? And it's kind of like, okay, I get it. If you have your the thing you like, and that you tend to go towards the things you like, but have a little, if you're going to do an overview of a field, have a little bit of more of an open mind about these things.
Brilliant. So, I mean, it's episode 1000, dude, and looking down across that incredible number, do you have any favorites?
I knew this was going to come. I actually have written out in my notebook here, like, all of the questions and my answers, because I was like, it was 3 o'clock in the morning and I was working, and I'm like, I better write some of this down so that I can, honestly, there's all kinds of, it would be wrong, I think, for me, I'm still going to do it, but it would be wrong for me to single out something. I will say at the top that I'm really happy that we gave forums for a whole bunch of new writers to really get their feet and get an audience, and that is very, very important to me. And I'm also really happy that we were able to institute things like the public domain showcase and get people who now to listen to older stories and realize that, there are really interesting things back here. So that's 2 sides of the coin. In terms of personal favorites, I've thought about this. I've said many times, I was really, really, really proud of how Christmas Present by Ramsey Campbell came out. I did the sound production on that, and that's still one that I point people towards, because it totally bam, 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 like, worked. I was really happy that we got to run Christine Rose Brooke Rose. I always get that reversed. Christine Brooke Rose story, Red Rubber Gloves.
I love that one.
Yeah, and she is such she's not a horror writer. She's a postmodern writer. It's just that she, that topic, that the subject that she was working on was, horrific in that story. And so it seemed perfect. So, there are any number of ones, though, as time has gone on. So many that I'm sure I've forgotten. Many, many, many. I'm trying to remember. There was one very early on when I was doing this for Ben, and I was just assistant editing, that I did my first kind of editorial move, in the sense of sending it back to the person and saying, this works, but these things need to be worked on. And, they sent it back, and when it came back, I was like, oh, this is so much a better story. I can't remember the damn name of it, but it's the one about the, oh gosh, well, I could just go on, but anyway, it was very effective. And so, yeah, there's any ones that I really love. I mean, I think one of the things I'm most proud of also is that we've just presented such a range of types, for people who just want, the people who just want gory stories are not going to be happy with everything we run, and the people who just want, kind of cute stories are not going to be happy with everything, and the people who want apolitical stories are not going to be happy with everything we run. And in a way, it sounds like a weird way to put it, but that's kind of the mark, I think, of a very good product, is when you're not putting stuff out there that not everybody will like, but if they keep coming back, then that proves it's like Twilight Zone. I'm rewatching old Twilight Zones from the beginning just recently, and it astonishes me now. I would never have thought of this when I was a kid watching them at 1 o'clock in the morning on the TV out of New York City, but it astonishes me now what a range. Like, what a big swing Rod Serling took with that show. You've got your twist in your tail stories, and you've got your science fiction, and you've got your, deals with the devil, and you've got your genie in a lamp and that type of thing. But you also just have you have comedy, and you have different forms of comedy, some of which doesn't work because Serling couldn't write comedy very well, but he tried. It's like it's fascinating to realize that, like, and I think it's something that you don't get as much nowadays, in truth, from a lot of the popular media that's produced. That is, I'm not going to say it's safe, because it'll still choose to do something challenging, but it'll only choose to do one thing challenging, and it's like, there's all kinds of, the best thing you can do for an audience is make them realize that there's just more and more and more out there if they keep looking. Never bore them,
We could talk about Twilight Zone for hours, because, like you, I'm making my way through that and Outer Limits at the moment, and Outer Limits for the first time. And I've never forgotten the first Twilight Zone episode I ever saw, but I have forgotten its title. And it's the one with the 3 astronauts who returned from space.
Ah, yes. As When the Sky Was Opened. Yeah.
when the sky was open.
Yeah.
And then after 15 minutes, it's 2 astronauts.
Yep.
And then after 15 minutes, it's 1 astronaut. And then, how awful, this automated space plane crashed on re-entry. And I love how the wrap-up for it is just, no, sometimes awful stuff happens. It's the Twilight Zone. We'll see you next week.
Yeah, exactly. It's like, there was somebody on some Reddit thread that was trying to make an argument that all Twilight Zone stories have a moral point. I was like, not really. Like, what's the moral point of Burgess Meredith breaking his glasses? There's no moral point there. But yeah, no. When the Sky Was Open, Matheson story. It's just great. So I mean,
A few years ago, I had the privilege to see the stage version, which was 9 episodes rammed together. And the way that they did it was someone was playing Serling, but at the end of each story, a member of the cast of that story would be possessed by Serling. And suddenly they'd notice the audience. And the cast were all taught this very particular close-up magic trick to produce a cigarette from out of nowhere. So the story would reach this kind of dramatic crescent, and suddenly someone would pop a cigarette out of thin air and go, "Here in the Twilight Zone, safety is an illusion," and walk 2 or 3 steps forward. And this was just pre-Fleabag as well, but it was a really Fleabag move. And everyone else on stage played like they were noticing it. They were like, "What the hell is this?" And just that idea of variety and versatility of offering so many different types of stories in such a condensed space, I think you're absolutely right, is so important, especially now. The other thing which I think about a lot is John Rogers, the showrunner on Leverage, talks a lot about how anytime he opens a new show, one of the first things he does is puts a post-it note on the whiteboard in the writer's room that reads, "Remember, you're in the miniseries business." Because by and large, the days of a 24-episode season are over.
Yeah.
And that means the weird stuff and the bottle shows and the things where you go, well, we've got a couple of spots in the season. This person who hasn't got a lot of experience but has a good idea, let's give them something to play with. Doesn't tend to happen as much, and that's a real shame.
Yeah. No, it's funny. I had this same reaction with a lot of the Marvel Comics movies, where I said to my friend, the funny thing is that everything needs to be rushed because it's a movie. So if it's like, if they're doing a Spider-Man movie and they introduce Gwen Stacy, if she's not dead by the end of that movie, she's going to be dead by the end of the second movie because they don't know that they're going to get a third movie, you know? And it's like, whereas she was around for years in the comic, you know, comics were just this endless petri dish of ideas, you know, just throwing stuff out, you know? And I don't necessarily know if rushing helps some of the characters, you know, in the sense of making them people that you like and things like that. I mean, Spider-Man is always going to be somebody you like because he's a friendly neighborhood Spider-Man. But like, you know, Batman, maybe he just comes across as more of a bully and a thug if, like, you know, they've got to wrap him up in 90 minutes, you know, and hopefully come back the next time, you know. So
I don't feel my age often, but one of the things that I'm very aware of is that when I was younger, I had no time at all for the Adam West Batman, because for me, Batman had to be this hard, sharp-edged, guy who does terrible things. And now the Adam West one's my favorite.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, I always say it now when people say, well, who's your favorite Batman? I'm like, Adam West. And I was actually lucky as a kid in that while it was, I was before the Frank Miller reinvention as the tough, you know, the tough killer Batman type guy. But I was lucky in that, along with horror, I had this fascination with comedy. And so I really immediately twigged on watching repeats to the fact that the Adam West Batman, was intended to be funny. And, you know, that just made it like, oh my God, this thing is hilarious the more I watch it. You know, I just like, so it's helped out, you know. But, you know, you mentioned, you know, feeling your age, and that was another thing that I had written down here, which is, you know, it's like, well, why now? Why 1,000?
Of course, my next question.
Yes, and it's like, you know, well, other than the fact that 1,000 is a nice round number, and my, you know, when I was a kid, we didn't have words for things like autism and spectrum and that type of stuff. But I can certainly say now, as a, you know, as an adult, as all the stuff comes in, I go, oh, this is me. Oh, okay, I get it. You know, like, you know, I had the discovery very much like Stuart Lee, the comedian, had the discovery, which was I was trying to put my music in order one time, and I was suddenly like, oh my God, there's something wrong with my mind. Like, I can just, like, you know, understand why I should have 5, you know, genres for this thing, and I can understand why I could have 85 genres for this thing. You know?
If it is any consolation, a couple of weeks ago I was talking to my therapist, and she kind of asked me to walk her through what I do for a living. And I listed the 6 different jobs I have at any given time. And there was a long pause, and I said, I'm never beating those neurodivergent allegations, am I? And she's like, no, I don't think you are.
Yeah. You know, mentioning Stuart Lee, I should say, by the way, he has a very, in the, not the Man Wolf, because I haven't seen that yet, but the previous special, he has a great extended joke over the last 30 minutes about kind of being diagnosed as being on the spectrum, and it becomes this thing where he incorporates all of his tendencies into it as he's trying to get the audience to react in this certain way, and nobody will, but he's like, and it's frustrating him more and more. You know, it was very, very brilliant. But yeah, no, I you know, so yeah, and then the other thing is, just to say the age, I'm coming up on 60, so, you know, it's like I do have
another nice round number, isn't it?
Yeah, you know, and you know, I've seemed to have found the world's most perfect job for someone like me, so that's great. You know, except it doesn't pay anything, but that's just the reality of life nowadays. So, you know, can't do anything about that. But you know, it's like, and also, honestly, I feel like I'm kind of well, over the last few years, I'll be honest, I feel like I haven't been pulling my weight at the show. Well, you know what? I love doing the public domain showcase. That just became more and more like the thing I looked forward to. I would start prepping for that in like September of the year, of the January before, and of course we prepped the year before the year that it has. So, but it just became that, and also honestly, I mean, I love horror in all of its forms, but I'm old enough now that I can know what I like and what I don't like, and I think my interests are just kind of sidling off. Like I've spent enough of a life where I've read all the pulp stuff I've wanted to read. I don't really need to read a pulp story again. I will, of course, but there's this point where everything's like mashed down, and like time is of the essence for the editor, but not for the writer. So he's going to figure out the most complicated way to say this, and as I've gotten older, I just like, what? I'm more interested now in like kind of these weird things that ran parallel, to horror per se. So like the Kant Cruel and the Decadent and the Expressionist areas kind of really fascinate me. So that's where I spent more of my reading time. And, you only have so much time in the world to read. So that means that, at a certain point, you're kind of like, oh, do I really want to read this next year's best? I mean, I know I can find some great stories in it and whatever, but this, volume of something from 1915 is calling my name. So,
once again, I know exactly whereof you speak. I'm coming up the way I came up through English literature. There's always part of me that goes, this looks like a really interesting poet, or this looks like a really interesting piece of classic literature. And the rest of my brain goes, yeah, but that's got a spaceship in it.
Yep. Yeah, how do you feel? And honestly, the weird thing is as you get older too, there becomes this, you don't give as much like kind of leeway to repetition, where you're just kind of like, oh, but this has got the things I like in it. But if the things you like are the same thing over and over again, you kind of you want subtlety and you want difference. You want these two kind of spices as opposed to the food being the same every time.
Right. It's so interesting hearing you say that, because I think a lot about Penn and Teller. And I think a lot about one of the things which I was taught, both coming up through theatrical magic and coming up through English lit like I was, which is that sometimes the execution is actually more important than the pleasant surprise. And your thing of, you want a little spice, and at the same time you want different food. And I love that. I love how these are two parallel paths, that you can go and find stuff that kind of speaks directly to you, but at the same time you can always find texts which are very familiar, but the act of them being executed always means they're executed in a different way.
Yeah.
And I find that tremendously reassuring, and I think that's why I watch so many 90-minute action movies which have a budget roughly the size of a $10 bill. It's great.
Because it's why I suffered through awful horror movies for like quarters of the year. It's like, because I'm hoping for that thrill again, and every once in a while there'll be something you go, oh, that was kind of neat, Like,
right? That was awful. Yeah, but the monster was good. That's where we lived.
It's true. So, yeah. So, I'm really happy. I'm happy with my time at PseudoPod. It came, when Ben asked me to take over, it was right after my sister had passed away, and it seemed like a good way to kind of involve myself in something very involving, that would take my mind, give me something to focus on. So, although I still always feel bad because the first month or so was kind of flubbed because I knew how to do everything except to actually put the show out. And so Ben didn't realize that. And so I'm like, what am I supposed to do next? And he thinks it's all done and it's walked away. And it's like after a month, everybody's like, how come there was no PseudoPod? I'm like, but yeah, no, it's it's been a hell of a ride, and I'm very proud of it. It is something I wrote down here. Was what's funny is that when I was a kid, I grew up in the late 70s era of bookmobiles and Scholastic Scope books and things like that. And they would have these wonderful anthologies of, say, spooky stories or whatever. And, the funny thing is that looking at them now and knowing what I know, I go, oh, okay, this is like 3/4, sometimes the whole thing, but 3/4 often is just public domain stuff that they got. Some old H.G. Wells story, by the 70s, it was in the public domain. So here it is, and and then occasionally they would like salt in a few things because by that point, there wasn't really a running horror magazine producing horror short fiction. They would salt in a few things from, say, Alfred Hitchcock Presents magazine or Ellery Queen or something. And as I look back on them now, I'm like, this is actually amazing in that it forced me to read all these different things from all these different time periods, and sometimes I would not understand a story, or it would be too complicated, or it would just the language would be too odd, so then you would put it aside and hopefully come back to it. So that was kind of, as a kid, that was my training. And then as I got older, I was like, maybe I'd like to be an editor of like anthologies. But of course, this was at the period in the 80s when reading began to decline. And, I grew up with Reading is Fundamental. RIF was RIF was this project that they were pushing for kids in the late 70s. And then, of course, in the 80s, everything was kind of defunded under Reagan, and reading declined, and it seems to also decline. There's this way. I was just to go off on a slight tangent. I was just reading a thing about how less people read, but the people who read more. So that's actually ended up becoming like a saving grace for bookstores now, is that like their sales are up, not because more people are reading, but it's just that the people that read more. So they buy more books. But anyway, and I was like, maybe I'd like to be an editor. And then, it was like, I began to realize, ooh, yeah, publishing. I did my internship at a publishing house in New York, and I was like, yeah, this doesn't look like it's something that's going to have much of a future. And at the same time, along with, as I was saying, horror and comedy, I loved audio. I was lucky enough as a kid to grow up with CBS Radio Mystery Theater out of WOR in North Jersey, and that meant that I got really fascinated with like audio and audio storytelling and things like that. And so when PseudoPod, when I first ran into it, I was like, oh, this is interesting. And I listened to a bunch of episodes, and then I talked to Ben about coming on as assistant editor. But and then it hadn't really occurred to me that this was going to be the perfect way of combining these things that interested me, into something that I could end up being really proud of by the end. And just knowing, I'm interested in the history of the form, as I think I've written about, the kind of, and not necessarily audio drama, but reading of fiction. And I'm right now going back and re-listening to a bunch of Mind Webs, which was a radio show on a college, Madison, Wisconsin college radio. The guy would read stories in the 70s, science fiction stories mostly. There are a few horror ones in there, but he would read science fiction stories and play like electronic music of the time, Tangerine Dream and things like that, and very, very strange stuff. And being a college radio station and being the way things were in the 70s, he didn't worry about rights at all. He just read things that he liked, but they're fascinating. They're fascinating. He's a really good performer. He would bring in other people from time to time. The use of music and electronic backdrops is fascinating. And to me, it's like that's why it's almost like, even with the fact that podcasts are, kind of now known as a quantity, and we have a name and all that, there's still the secret form. They're this like secret thing that's going on. It's like radio was back in the day. People would think of radio and just think, oh, it's just this disposable thing that's on, when I'm at the beach or whatever. But people that loved radio really loved it, because you would realize, oh, it's like this whole other world that's sneaking in,
Oh yeah, I'm with you 100%. So much so that as you were talking, I was reminded of the fact that there's a lost Nigel Neal play, which isn't actually that lost anymore, that the BBC have adapted a couple of years ago, and they've remembered they have it on the books, so it's back on various bits of YouTube now. So I should go listen to that at some point, I guess.
Is that the time travel-y one? Something? It's like
that's The Road.
The Road,
which is which is the I think immediately post English Civil War witchfinder, who happens to, it's basically the other version of the Stone Tape, where they inadvertently discuss, right? I think it is actually called You Must Listen, and it's one of those kind of very Nigel Neal things where it's a bunch of grumpy, sarcastic engineers being grumpy and sarcastic at one another, and then something awful and unexplained happens. And the whole thing is them trying to understand the awful, unexplained thing. And it's really tidily put together, and it's like the Stone Tape. It actually updates really nicely. There's a couple of really fun kind of universal elements to it that always work.
Yeah, I mean, well, hell, Nigel Neal is an amazing talent. I made the point a few years ago of going back and watching all the Quatermass stuff from beginning to end, all the TV plays or what survived of them, and then the movies, and then up to and including the 70s one with the hippies, and it was amazing. It was amazing stuff. Like, you began to realize that, like, oh, there's actually this interesting thread throughout where he's reworking the idea of colonialism, but like as us being a colony, so at first it's just infection, and then it's essentially mind control, and then it's a thing where it turns out we were the slave race for the Martians. It's like, this really amazing stuff.
One of my absolute favorite things was the moment when I was watching the first couple of episodes of Luther, the Idris Elba detective series. And I realized that the police station he works out of is the police station in Quatermass in the
book. That's great.
And the connectivity like that just always tickles my brain. It always feels really nice.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, and it's I have to say it's been nice to see him getting kind of his due. I mean, I'm sure he did at the time, but I know they've just put out a big collection of essays. We Are the Martians or something.
That's
and it's like good. Like it's for the best that these people get remembered and re-examined. Because.
Exactly.
If not, we're just going to keep making the same stupid mistakes over and over again in our culture. Although that we haven't seemed to have backed off of that yet either. So,
it's a work in progress. It was so funny watching the Stone Tape last Christmas, because I got the kind of funky version with a couple of little documentaries on it, and one of them was kind of, so how much was Nigel Neal's work influenced by his childhood on the Isle of Man? And it's basically someone walking around 5 places about a mile away from where I went to school with, going, a lot. It was a lot.
One of the things I always loved was I'm just totally discoursing here. We may need to cut this at some point, but there was a great something about it was a discussion. I think it was with Nigel Neal about the Stone Tape, and he makes this great point about how when they filmed it, technology was still at a point where, on the one hand, you could say, as you just did, the story can be brought forward and still has resonance in modern, life. But also when they filmed the BBC TV version of it, was it ITV? I don't remember. Technology was at a point where everything still had a visual element that you could film, whereas now it would all be digital and be boring to look at. But this was back in the days of reel-to-reel tapes and things, so it was like it gave you something to look at, on the screen, and it's like, that kind of ability to just realize things like that is great. Like, to me, that's like the kind of details, people who think that criticism is just I liked it or I didn't like it or it didn't scare me. It's like, no, exactly. Man, there's so much more there. Just take a moment and think and look and put in context.
Exactly. Shawn, we could talk about this stuff for hours, and I suspect we will at another time. Before we sign off, and I will say this to you a couple of dozen times before episode 1000, I'm sure, but first, thanks. Working with you has been an extraordinary pleasure. I have learned more than I can ever articulate, and you've just been a joy to work with. Thanks, dude.
Well, thank you. I mean, I couldn't ask for a better host, honestly. And really, and you are the face of the show. The audio face. You're the voice of the show. And that means a lot. It's really important that people have, especially with something like we do, an anthology where it's different every time. You're the hook that the audience knows is going to be there, to come back to, and you're great at it. Everybody loves hearing you. So
Thanks. It's my favorite job, and working with you has been a huge part of that, and I love that we have like a flotilla of hosts now, and I love that we've got to episode 1000, and I'm going to keep you very informed about what happens next.
Oh yeah, I'll still be listening and watching, and
this is the secret that no one ever quite figures out. No one actually leaves Escape Artists. we talk about it like the Starfleet Admiral's Lounge. Everyone who's ever worked with us just pops back from time to time, and you will, I'm sure, be absolutely not.
I unfortunately can't help but think of it as the Library of Skulls from Land of the Lost. I'm just this a skull down on a pillar somewhere in a basement with a bunch of cobwebs, and they come back to it. We need to know what would be a good story from 1935 to hold on, I will recover it from my mind. So,
for legal reasons, I have to state on the record that we do not have a library like that at PseudoPod.
Not that anyone could find, at least. So.
Not that anyone could find more than once. Shawn, this has been a blast. Thanks so much.
No problem at all. And here's to another 1000. Yes.
Thanks so much, buddy, for everything. An enormous thanks too for Graeme, as I say, for putting that audio together with this audio. Now, we just rolled out ads. Don't worry, no mid-roll, and we're never doing mid-roll, but we're doing ads at the top and bottom of each show. We have an ad-free tier on our Patreon that costs $7 a month, and that gives you access to our feeds all the way back to episode 1. So if you want to go ad-free, go to our Patreon and sign up. Or go to pseudopod.org and click on Feed the Pod, because the tentacles, always hunger. And if you can't subscribe, we still need and welcome one-time donations. Ads help, but the primary engine is still and always will be you. Subscribing helps. Individual donations help. And if there is a method of support we don't do but that you'd like, reach out to us at donations@escapeartists.net and let's chat about it. If you can't afford to support us financially at all, we get it. Times are hard. But we would also like to ask that you please consider leaving reviews of our episodes or generally talking about them on whichever social media platform feels the least like The Purge this week. In the absence of that, we now have a Blue Sky account, and we would love to see you there. Find us at pseudopod.org. If you like merch, you can also support us by buying hoodies, t-shirts, and other bits and pieces from the Escape Artists Void merch store. The link is in various places, including our pinned tweet. Regardless of what you do, thank you. And thank you for listening. PseudoPod is part of the Escape Artists Foundation, which is a 501c3 non-profit, and this episode is distributed under the Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License. Download and listen to the episode on any device you like. Don't change it. Don't sell it. Theme music is by permission of Anders Manga. Join us later today for the Halloween parade and another surprise. And PseudoPod leaves you this week in the safe hands of Grandmaster Flash. Pay your toll, sell your soul. Pound for pound costs more than gold. We'll see you next time. Until then, have fun.
When you listen to a narrator or let yourself go into a story, you are letting yourself go into the car of a stranger. You are getting into the car of a stranger. You are walking in the front door of someone you do not know.
It's a pseudopod. It's a big foot.
It's all about podcasts these days.